we're going to go back a little bit to what you looked at in the first forum, which was some of the evidence around this work. In going back to remind ourselves of that evidence, it's to ask you to ponder, what have you done since you first came across the new understandings around the power of engaging with families to drive learning outcomes? And to ask what's different in your school community now in terms of the structures you've set up, in terms of the PL you've been doing with your staff, in terms of the whole culture of learning and teaching. So let's just have a little quick look back and see how we're going. So just in asking that question, and for many of us who have been around for quite a while in education, and I look around the room and I think there's quite a few of us, we've always been talking about engaging family and learning, but the evidence has changed significantly. This is not about engaging with families from a welfare perspective. This is not about doing more of the same. This is looking at the overwhelming evidence that says unless we do this, we're never going to address that gap and really transform opportunities. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but just to sort of look at the moral imperative. ARACI, the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, Australian Family, School and Partnerships Bureau, after an in-depth analysis of the current evidence, the report concludes that positive parental engagement in learning improves academic achievement, well-being and productivity. It further concludes that resourcing and effectively progressing parental engagement is warranted, if not essential, to educational reform. In other words, unless, like all of us, we're passionate about mitigating the gap, why is it that some young people have all these life chances and pathways and others don't? It's not because of innate ability. They're saying that this area, working strategically as you are, in this spot around family engagement can make the difference. So it's not about saying, let's look at our annual action plans, our school plans, and then see what are we doing with families. No, it's about saying, how do we bring family engagement into the centre to really drive learning and teaching in different ways? So this morning will be a chance for you to share what you're currently doing in that space and perhaps then to dream a little bit larger around where we can go in this space. So we know the answer to this. We know it's significant. And we know that the work of Anne Henderson from the United States, who was here in Melbourne last year and other parts of Australia, she was significant because she brought together not just her research, but overwhelming evidence of a number of studies that says if we keep on ignoring families and keep on not doing to families, not raising the bar with families, but recognising that they are the first educators and then being school-led to say how do we involve them in learning. And it doesn't mean from a secondary point of view, because I know us who have come from secondary think kids don't want their parents sitting in classrooms wandering around the yard. So this work's not saying that. This work's not saying that engagement in learning needs to have families at the school. It's about recognising that learning happens everywhere. Kids spend so very little amount of time in school compared to their whole life. So engaging families, helping families recognise that the work they do with their kids, helping them become organised, having shared conversations, those things that schools can lead to empower parents. So building that partnership around the necessity of having engagement is the missing link that some of us need to and can explore further. So just to look at some of these things again if you know, but to remind us, if we can lead this from a school point of view, so have our action plans, have our annual action plans positioning this work as part of our learning and teaching, these are some of the outcomes that have been demonstrating over and over again. And it gives us a little bit more detail into how to do this. So we know from a school improvement point of view, we always, and we get led by regions around the top three. And the evidence always says it's about leadership, it's about pedagogy, instructional guidance, it's about building teacher capacity. And we always talk about the lower two, building that connective climate where kids are engaged and feel safe and want to come to our wonderful schools. And it's about parent-school ties. But often in my experience, not through lack of intention, but a lack of focus strategically, the top three get positioned around driving learning outcomes. And the bottom two are sort of, and what are we doing in this space? what this work is saying, what the evidence that you know is saying, we have to shine the light on saying, no, it's the 5 areas being worked with strategically that can make the difference to learning outcomes. And to ask the question, in our school communities, where is the positioning around these 5? We looked quickly around what are teachers doing if they're in schools where your leadership and your professional learning programs is really driving their thinking around learning and teaching in new ways, because they're understanding that families are engaged and need to be welcomed in that engagement. And it talked particularly around saying, if any of these are undermined in terms of their strengths, it won't have the impact on learning. So it's about talking about the multiple strengths by combining the focus on these areas. So asking these questions, we know that the research is quite simple in some ways. It says the 2 biggest factors in driving the links between family engagement and learning is developing shared high aspirations. You know all this. If families have shared dreams and their dreams are validated and they're supported in continuing to have those shared dreams, that can make a difference. Also, when they come into schools and we communicate with families sometimes, we can make assumptions around the language of schooling. And schools here are doing fantastic things, just having little focus groups and saying, here's our newsletter, here's our work on the web. Does this make sense? How can we make this plain English? So that when we talk about schooling, we're talking about it in ways that make it accessible. So those 2 things, language of schooling and high aspirations alone, can make a huge difference, but they need to be school-led, planned strategically, not left to chance, not left to one person, not left to a hub or a building, but integral to the whole culture of the school that you're developing. Look at these things, simple things. Meeting face-to-face, really working collaboratively with families around things that we can send home. So we shouldn't need to be able to speak English or to have formal education ourselves. We're not talking about doing the teaching and learning in families. We're talking about bridging the gap between aspirations, sharing dreams, aspirations around the things that we can learn together, the things that broker that engagement, that connection between home and school, so that when kids come to school, they don't think they're living in 2 worlds, but they're living in a world where they know that their families and their schools have a shared commitment to education and that they feel comfortable in each other's space. And what we're saying most particularly is that won't happen unless it's led by you, strategically embedded in your school programs and your annual action plans, until the hearts and minds are saying, this is the way we do business in this place. This is our first priority. How, from a secondary school point of view, do we actually have conversations around shared high expectations? Do we still have notions of teacher-student interviews where we meet with families and we tell parents what's happening in learning? Or do we have teacher-learning conversations where we come together with families, with the student present, with some teaching learning activities that they've selected to talk about together and start to broker that engagement? Do we talk around the power of having shared dreams and keeping dreams alive? I was at a school the other day and they were talking about doing this, and already little kids in primary school, when they named, for example, I wanted to be a teacher, and they said, oh, I have to go to uni or TAFE for that, they said, oh, I can't do that. Because we know that for many of us, we've been fortunate, we've had those pathway choices. For some of our families, we haven't had that, not through lack of ability, but through lack of choice. And part of that is beginning to see that this can be for me. And it doesn't mean we all need to go to university, but why should it be a choice for some and not for others? And part of that is a belief system. And part of that can be led by schools, keeping the beliefs alive. We know that when little kids start in prep, all their families have all the dreams alive for all of them. We know by grade 5, they've often dropped their beliefs around where their kid can go on to, because they're living their experience, they're living there. Our schools, you, can help to keep dreams alive, but you need to drive that strategically. How are you having conversations where people's beliefs know that life chances, life pathways are for all? And they're living in the best part of Melbourne to do that, because the work that you're doing strategically, collaboratively, is fantastic. This was a real shock for me when I started to delve into the research. So often, most of my life in classrooms had been spent on the right-hand side. Because now the evidence is clearer, it's not about doing anything, it's about saying, what does the evidence tell us are the best approaches to make the link around achievement? And so for me, I spent my life saying, you know, reading at home, can you take your tables home? Whereas what I learnt was, if we can come together in partnership, come together in engagement, through working together around how we can share reading at home, how we can talk about reading at home. And this was important, the third one, the co-construction of ideas. So fantastic schools in this place are making literacy games and numeracy games to send home. The strength is when they're having nights and family nights where they co-construct those games. That's where the power of learning is. That's where the power of engagement to lead to better outcomes can be. As well as the previous one, conversations with parents, not telling them how, but talking about their dreams for kids around learning, talking around how they can support their children at home, talking with them around what they're currently doing to support their children at home. From simple things like having your bedroom tidy, being organised, you know that those things transfer back into learning. So we're not saying here you need to be fantastic at algebraic expressions or abstractions. We're talking around conversations around that partnership and validating that families are doing most of the learning with their kids anyway, and they're coming into our space for a small part of the time. So how powerful can it be if we bridge that 20/80 and make it a real partnership? Other ideas, and again, I just put a few down, but you would have been thinking about these and doing other things as well. We've touched on some of those. And most importantly, the last one. How often do we go to our parents and ask them their opinion? Get them involved, get them as part of our focus groups and our discussion groups. Today is about saying, knowing that we know this, how are you leading and embedding this work in your action plans, in your strategies at your school? Some of us have seen this before, but if we're honest with ourselves and quickly looked at what Anne Henderson says is the sort of continuum from where we'd like to be in an ideal partnership-based school where it's part of the community, it's a community in its own right, but it's also part of the broader community. It's part of trying to build the fabric of society across this fantastic area of Melbourne so that all kids have opportunities, all kids know they've got choices. Where do you think your school's at the moment in terms of the modelling of the school? We do whatever it takes. We believe in this so much that we know we can no longer lock our classroom doors and go about learning and teaching in the way we've always done. Because if we keep on doing it the way we've always done in Australia, we're going to keep on getting the results, where some kids miss out through no fault of their own. So this work is saying it's an absolute moral imperative that this work becomes core to the way that we drive our school and our school improvement. We know we can't have engagement with families unless we build strong relationships and unless that sense of welcome is from the moment they phone the school or go to the office. The link to learning is when we engage our families with learning, and the evidence around that is absolutely clear. And just to summarise, this work from the OECD, it's being said again and again and again. And so the question it asks for us today, as we demonstrate that our hearts and minds are already committed to this space because we're here. When I talk to fantastic schools in this place, the work you're leading is second to none. So how do we keep on shining a light on this part of Melbourne to say that the real movers and shakers in this area are here because they're embedding this work strategically? So hopefully by the time you get to lunchtime today, you will have had a chance to validate the wonderful work that you're leading, to share in conversation with other people around how you can take this further forward, and to ask yourself the quite hard question, is this work peripheral to our learning, or is it absolutely central to the learning and the way we do business in our school? We might have just a chance just for a couple of questions, if anyone would have a question before we move on to our parent panel.
Good morning. Yes, Philip Illman from Hume Valley School. The practices that you've been speaking about this morning and the research, I'm wondering whether we can draw some similarities for those parents of students who have a disability, and making those connections to either a mainstream school or a special needs school.
Thanks, Philip. Really good question. I think it's a question we ask ourselves all the time. I mean, my take on this, and the research validates it, is that we all have special needs. It's a matter of depth and breadth of those needs. And good practice doesn't separate cultures or needs. It says that good practice for human beings are good practice. Good practice in learning and teaching are often through the lens of what do we need to do for kids with particular needs. And so often the real positive in kids with special needs is that the parents are central, because the needs sometimes are so significant. We know unless we sit with the family and begin to plan the learning and teaching program, nothing will work. Equally, for people for English may not be their first language, often good practice says that we need to work with families around the particular needs and work with them. So my take is it's almost the opposite. The leadership in educational good practices has often been through the lens of kids with disabilities or young people with particular learning needs. And then we need to mainstream that up. So this work with families is often being left for only particular cohorts of kids. And what this research is saying, we need to push it into the mainstream so it becomes central if we're going to really redress and address those learning achievements and the lack of opportunities for some. Hope that answers your question. Thanks, Philip.